This is a conversion kit for the WL-Toys 284131, K989, and similar models. Perfect if you want to turn your RC into an RWD drift car. I've already tested it and the performance is quite good even with the stock electronics. Welcome to KuikMix, and this is a video about installing the BellX-M2 conversion kit on a 1/28 scale WL-Toys. You'll find several new design ideas here that haven't been done before. There are a few advantages to using this bulkhead compared to modifying the stock parts, but I won't go over all of them since this video is already quite long. The main advantage, in my opinion, is the softer suspension with longer travel. As you can see, the rear barely moves at all when lifted. Longer suspension travel helps maintain better front tire traction for improved control. I also designed camber gain, where the camber increases as the suspension compresses. However, as you can see when turning, the leading tire doesn't tilt much and stays nearly upright, helping maintain traction. Before continuing, I'll explain a few important things first, since I won't be answering questions already covered in the video. And I also shared a bit that this modification is the most difficult and time-consuming one compared to my other mods. The reason is that I set a lot of requirements for myself. First, I wanted to make sure the original electronics could still be used. Second, I wanted the design to support not only the stock servo, but also the SG92R servo, which is slightly larger. Third, I aimed for a setup that doesn't require any extra parts. For example, I didn't want to use aftermarket ball ends or bearings. The reason is that some people in certain areas might find it difficult to get such small ball ends or bearings. Fourth, I wanted the design to be easy to print and tolerant of printer differences. I'll explain more about this later. Lastly, this part was tricky because of the RC's small size. 3D printed parts need enough thickness for strength, so the design had to be very precise. For the first time, I realized that even a 0.5mm difference could make a huge impact. But after almost 2 months of brainstorming and trial and error, thank God, I finally came up with a design that performs really well for drifting. Let's start with the rod end. At first I designed it like this. I could fine-tune the tightness to match my own printer. However, when others tried printing it, the sit could end up too tight or too loose, causing it not to move smoothly. That's why I redesigned the rod end like this, with the ball end-like function. Because it's tapered, you can adjust the tightness simply by tightening or loosening the screw. Next, for the front wheel hub, I designed the bearing mount not as a plain circle, but with 4 rectangular blocks like this. The purpose is to compensate for printer tolerance differences. Box or block shapes are generally more accurate than circular ones. Also, if the printed part turns out slightly smaller and the bearing doesn't fit, it's much easier to file down 4 flat sides than a full circle. And if the hub diameter is a bit too large, you can simply shim it with paper. I also designed the hub so it can be printed without supports. That's why the middle section is square instead of round. Lastly, for all self-tapping screws, I designed the holes not as plain circles, but with 3 anchor points like this. The goal is to make sure the 3D printed material doesn't crack easily while still maintaining a strong grip. For reference, I shortened the front CVD a bit. Here's the comparison with the stock one. But if you don't want to shorten it, that's totally fine. You'll just need to use shorter screws so they don't hit the CVD. Use 5mm screws on the lower side and 7mm on the upper side if you keep the stock CVD. If you do shorten the CVD, you can use longer screws. It only took me about 5 minutes using a large file to shorten mine. Next, remove the ball head from the old shock tower you're no longer using and install it on the bell crank rod. Mount it on the flat side and make sure the screw tip doesn't stick out, otherwise it can catch and cause friction. If the screw is too long, you can cut or file it down first. Install a 10mm screw on the bulkhead, then mount the bell crank rod in the orientation shown in the video. The flat side should face downward. Make sure it moves smoothly. If not, enlarge the hinge hole slightly using a 2mm drill bit. As you can see, the clearance here is quite tight. Attach a lock nut, the kind that stays in place even without being tightened hard. Ensure the movement is smooth but not too loose. Now install an M2 by 7mm screw on the spring holder area. Then mount the spring holder. Note that the front and rear designs are different, so don't mix them up. To adjust spring stiffness, place an M2 washer on the screw before the spring holder as a spacer. Each washer is about 0.5 millimeters thick, and even that makes a noticeable difference. Once everything is assembled, you only need to remove the upper arm screw and hub to adjust spring stiffness further. When attaching the upper arm screw, you can install it from the back like this, or from the front like this. The smoother pivot point is at the bulkhead. If you install it from the front, you don't need a lock nut because the upper arm is self-tapping. However, if you install it from the back, you'll need to use a lock nut again. Don't swap left and right, follow the orientation shown in the video. Adjust the lock nut's tightness so the upper arm moves freely. I trimmed the excess upper arm screw just to make it look neat, then filed it smooth. The screw length from the upper arm to the bulkhead is approximately 13 millimeters. Next, we'll need an M2 18mm screw, though you can adjust the length based on your setup. Before cutting a screw, I usually thread a nut onto it first, then cut it. After cutting, I remove the nut. This helps reshape the threads at the tip and prevents the end from flaring out, which could damage the 3D printed part. Install it on the upper arm. There are two holes, the front one for zero caster and the rear one for positive caster. I recommend using the rear hole for positive caster. Next, attach the upper arm rod end. Remove the spring from the stock shock, then install it under the upper arm. Now move to the lower arm. Make sure the hinge moves smoothly. The left and right hinges have the same shape, but the rod end tips are different. Install the screws, but don't tighten them all the way. I used 7mm screws. Ensure the lower arm can still move freely. For the next step, I used 11mm screws to attach it to the bulkhead. Any longer than that, and they might hit the tire at full steering lock. Once installed, check that the lower arm moves smoothly and that the curved side faces downward. Then, attach the hub to both the upper and lower arms. If you haven't shortened the stock CVD, use a 7mm screw for the upper arm and a 5mm screw for the lower arm. Adjust the screw tightness, not too tight so everything moves smoothly, but not too loose either. If you change the camber angle, you may need to readjust the upper arm screw tightness to prevent wobbling while keeping smooth motion. Finally, use a 19mm screw to connect the steering rod ends. Install the steering rod ends as shown in the video. The distance between the rod ends will affect your toe-in and toe-out angles. Install the rod end onto the bell crank connector as shown in the video. Make sure not to flip it upside down since that would make it too high and cause it to hit the bulkhead. Insert the screw from the bottom and don't over-tighten it. The connecting rod should still move up and down smoothly without being too loose. You can add a lock nut on top if you want, though it's optional since the rod end is designed to be self-tapping. If you decide to use a lock nut, use a 7 to 8mm screw. Next, attach it to the bell crank rod. Again, don't fully tighten the screw. The bell crank should still move freely. Now install the left and right steering rods from the stock parts. Note that the rod design is different on each side. Install them as shown in the video to avoid hitting the servo bracket later. Move the connecting rod by hand to make sure it feels smooth and doesn't require much force. When testing, don't pull straight, but slightly at an angle. The design takes into account the servo's position. Attach the bulkhead to the chassis using M2 screws. Try fine thread screws first. If they feel loose, use the coarse thread screws from the original WL Toys kit. To connect the bell crank to the hub, use a 13mm screw. This longer screw also acts as a stopper, preventing the wheels from turning too far in the opposite direction, which could cause steering lock. Now install the servo. If you're using the stock servo, attach the servo adapter first before mounting it to the bracket. The front and rear sides of the bracket have slightly different angles. Reversing them only affects appearance, not function. Use 12mm screws to secure the servo. Insert the connecting rod before attaching the bracket to the chassis since the space is quite tight. After that, secure it with the two screws. Anyway, if you're using a larger servo like SG92R, the ball head needs to be flipped upside down as shown in the video, then attached to the servo arm. Mount it directly to the bracket, no adapter needed. Also, make sure the servo arm isn't positioned at a perfect 9-degree angle. Tilt it slightly as shown in the video so that left and right steering angles are balanced. Because the servo arm sits very close to the deck, make sure the ball head screw doesn't stick out and touch the deck. For the body post, I designed a simple one. Install this part first, then attach this other piece to the body using double-sided tape, glue gun, or any adhesive. To mount it, just slide it in. You can adjust the height using lock nuts or spacers. You don't need to lock it tight, the body's weight will hold it in, and since this is for drifting, that's more than enough. By the way, I slightly trimmed the front fenders of my 284131 so the front wheels can steer freely. I also designed an upper deck. Install it with 3 screws at the back. It's optional, so you don't have to print it. There's also a battery holder like this, just screw it onto the chassis. Note, if you're using the stock servo, you'll need to add a spacer under the holder, otherwise it will hit the servo arm. If you're using an SG92R or similar servo, you don't need a spacer for the battery holder. Alternatively, if you don't want to print the battery holder, you can mount the battery at the rear using a rubber band. Placing the battery at the back shifts the center of gravity rearward, which helps with smoother, longer drifts, but makes the car less agile when switching direction in tight spaces. For reference, when using the stock servo, I use the inner hole on the servo arm. This slightly reduces the maximum steering angle, so the turns aren't as sharp, but it actually feels more stable for drifting. Here's a clip showing the stock servo with the outermost hole set up. If you watch closely, the servo sometimes becomes twitchy or unstable. Meanwhile, with the ball head mounted on the second inner hole, the steering feels much smoother and more stable. I think the reason is that when you set the maximum steering angle, the steering becomes too responsive. With the stock electronics, this actually makes the car less stable. This is also why I couldn't get the alpha version to handle nicely, even though it can steer up to 90 degrees. In practice, the steering feels too sensitive and overreactive. It's a different story if you've upgraded the electronics, because then you can fine-tune the dual rate and steering curve, allowing maximum angle with smooth control for drifting. But I won't cover that here, since the main focus of this mod is keeping it compatible with stock electronics and as low budget as possible. Thanks for watching KuikMix. I hope this video helped someone out there. See you in the next one.